Right. Hi, and welcome to another short discussion in celebration for reaching 50 episodes of Demystifying Mental Toughness Podcast. And today I'm joined by Doug Strycharczyk. Did I get the pronunciation right there?
You've got to get for languages there, David.
Excellent. So Doug is seen as a pioneer, or in some people's eyes, as a rock star in the mental toughness field. You're an author of many books, aren't you, in this space? And today we're going to have a chat about mental toughness and how the 4Cs framework helps us understand psychological safety. So to start with, Doug, do you want to tell the viewers and the listeners what psychological safety is?
Okay, well, psychological safety is not a new idea. It's actually a new term. I think we've called it many things in the past, and it is important. I think the best way of describing it is I'm going to lift a definition from a Harvard professor, Amy Edmondson. She describes it as creating a team climate or a climate where people are encouraged to take risks fearlessly and which nurtures mutual trust, support, and respect. And the consequence is, she describes it as employees then don't feel the need to censor themselves before talking and are not afraid to speak up. But actually, there's probably a more positive way of describing that, is that's people are happy to engage in an organization, ask questions, make their contributions without fear of any risk of psychological negative effects. And I think we've all been there, haven't we, over the years? I remember my very first job, which, funnily enough, David, was a stone's throw from you in Darlington. I worked for a very old-fashioned company, which was beyond command and control. You were not allowed to ask a question. You were not allowed to say anything. And even if you spotted something that was patently wrong and shouldn't be there, you weren't allowed to say anything about it because it was interpreted as a criticism of the management. And it was very, very stressful. There was zero psychological safety there.
Yeah, and in that environment, as an employee, you're not really going to be able to show your vulnerable side, are you? You're going to be looking over your shoulder an awful lot and taking risks. You're not going to do that either. You're just going to play things quite safe.
Oh, absolutely. And you instead of becoming the best version of you that you can be, you become the smallest version of you that you can be, that can get away with not getting any sort of negative reaction from the people around you.
Yeah, and I suppose if we think of the 4Cs framework, confidence in our ability is one of them. You're certainly not going to be promoting a confident individual or confident team, for that matter.
Yeah, well, if you step back and look at psychological safety, I think it's got, lots of people talk about two dimensions. One is the organization and the culture. Does that enable psychological safety? But then there's the other side, because you have come across really good environments where people are encouraged to speak out, and yet some people don't, and some people are still fearful of saying something in case they say the wrong thing. And so there's the other perspective. There's the individual perspective. You can create a great environment, but two people will still see that environment in two different ways. So we need to understand their perspective, as well as the organization creating the opportunity for psychological safety.
So from a leadership point of view, what are the qualities a good leader needs to demonstrate in order to promote this type of culture and environment?
Well, I think we can link the two, both through the mental toughness framework. The mental toughness framework has got four big elements: control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. But if you look at each of the individual elements, each matters for the individual, but each matters also for the person and the leadership or the influencing position. So if I give a very simple example, one of the elements of the mental toughness framework is life control. And that's the most accurate way of describing that is a sense of self-worth. It's where the sense of can-do sits. So some of us will have a sense of can-do. If we come across something, we'll go and have a go. We might even speak out about it. Others don't have that sense of can-do, and they kind of minimize it. So that's the individual's perspective. But if you look at the leader's perspective, it's most common for people who are in leadership roles or positions of influence to be more mentally tough than average. So they've got high levels of life control. They've got a high sense of self-worth, a high sense of can-do. If they're not self-aware about that, they can create a problem for the individual. And by that, I mean, they will have a mindset, I can do it. Why can't everybody else? And if they express that, what they're actually doing to the people around them is they're effectively shutting them down, because they're telling them they're not as good as he or she is. So there is a curious interplay, but the common link is mental toughness, the way that both parties approach the same event in their heads.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose if you're that type of individual who's a can-doer, if you're trying to delegate a task to someone and they're not doing it proficiently, then you've got to try and force yourself to back off. Otherwise they're not going to end up developing that trait.
Yeah. And if you look at, they say, the confidence quadrant of the mental toughness framework, I suppose in the last 2 or 3 years, we've learned a lot about interpersonal confidence. It's always been there. It's almost like psychological safety. It's a concept we've always known, but have we known it well enough? Because and a lot of people have seen it in the past as being about being, to a degree, assertive. Can I influence other people in the same way that they will influence me? That's an important aspect of psychological safety, believing that you can influence people. But there's another dimension that we began to see quite a lot, and it's about another kind of engagement with people. It's about asking questions. And, if you think about our journey through life or through work, every day we come across things that we don't know or don't fully understand. And what we very often see, especially in meetings, is that somebody will sit in a meeting, somebody will pontificate, they'll all agree to do something, and you walk out that meeting thinking, I'm not sure I understood that, but I've got a job to do. So they've given me a task. And then you say to the individual, well, why didn't you ask a question? Why didn't you ask questions? Why didn't you ask for clarification? I didn't want to look stupid. And, think, oh my goodness. And you see that in school, in education, kids will sit in the class, not quite understand what the teacher said. And very often they won't ask the teacher, they go and ask their mates, because that's the safest thing to do. And so, I'm beginning to understand actually the ability to ask questions freely without worrying about what it feels like or looks like is one of the big aspects of psychological safety, because we don't start in life knowing everything. And I tell you something, when you get to the end of your life, you still don't know everything.
Yeah, I know I've been there personally, where I have kept quiet, and I certainly haven't spoken up.
Me too.
Yeah, and I suppose in an environment, a lot of that's around the blame game. If there's a blame culture somewhere, then people aren't going to open up and ask the questions.
Yeah, and then sort of switching, because we're just talking about the individual perspective again. Suddenly, the person, one of the key people in the room, has got a high level of interpersonal confidence, and that's great. That person doesn't worry about what people think about them. They'll ask questions. They'll say what they think without being concerned about it. But if they are too mentally tough and don't have self-awareness, it's very easy for them to dominate a discussion, dominate a conversation, to shut people out. So even if you've got a low level of interpersonal confidence and you're waiting for your moment to be able to say something, it never arises, because the more interpersonally confident people in the room have actually blocked you out. And so one of the things we're learning about, creating a genuinely diverse environment requires the mentally tough to be self-aware and the mentally sensitive to be self-aware, and to be self-aware about the way they interact with each other.
So in effect, as you say there, it all gets back to being self-aware, regardless of where you sit on that continuum.
Yeah, and the risk is, I like the way this conversation is going. The bane of our life, when people start talking about on average, there isn't such a thing as an average person. We're all individuals. And you can have 20 people sat around a table, and there'll be 20 different potential responses from around that table. So it's not really helpful to talk about Some people typically respond in this way. Some people typically respond that way. We're all quite different, and we're all quite nuanced, and we do need that level of self-awareness.
Yeah, I suppose bringing out people's strengths as well is an important factor in this, and actually embracing the fact that we all have positive things to be able to share and give.
Oh, God, that's absolutely. And we actually strenuously avoid talking about mental strength and mental weakness, because the continuum is mental toughness and mental sensitivity. A mentally tough individual is somebody who breezes through life. For them, psychological safety is not an issue. They're kind of, I think Peter Clough describes it as they're comfortable in their own skin. So they're not worried about psychological negative consequences. A mentally sensitive individual feels every bump on the road. Somebody says something, they think, they're having a go at me. Something went wrong. Is it my fault? That sort of thing. And for them, psychological safety is a big issue. But it's the interplay between those two. And we also know that, and I think I illustrated before, you can have a high level of life control. That's a massive strength. You've got an advantage in life. You're going to do things that other people can't do. But if your approach to other people is, I can do it, why can't you? You're actually also developing and demonstrating a weakness. Because instead of gathering people around you and helping them to make their contribution, you're effectively shutting them down. And you're actually really making life more difficult for yourself. I think people with a high sense of can-do don't see that, because they think they can do it anyway. So self-awareness is really, really important.
Yeah, so that type of individual is going to have to be very clear in terms of their body language and whether they're actually demonstrating empathy and skills associated with being a caring person.
So, when we talk about the mental toughness concept, we now know there's a profile with 8 components. The thing that we've been learning, especially in the last few years, is hardly any of us are mentally tough on all 8 components or mentally sensitive on all 8 components. We're mostly a mixture. We might be mentally tough on 6, but we might have mental sensitivity in a couple of areas. And for large chunks of our lives, that doesn't matter. But COVID has really exposed some of these issues for senior leaders in organizations, because suddenly degrees of their mental sensitivity that didn't really matter before have suddenly become, they're almost like a burst ulcer. They suddenly become a big issue. And if you've drifted through life and you've been successful, you're not really aware of your weaknesses as such.
Yeah, you just plow on and just you're on the treadmill. In effect, you just keep moving on from day to day.
Yeah.
So where you talk about some of the challenges and issues there with senior leaders, what can you provide some examples there?
Yeah, so I was fascinated by, I would say, the biggest growth in, I would say, the middle of last year and towards the end of last year was around the impact on senior leaders, senior and middle leaders in organizations. And for the very effect I was talking about before, they'd been successful for 10 years. They didn't see themselves as perceiving any particularly significant weaknesses. And yet, for a lot of them, life would come to a shuddering halt. And I've got one particular example of an individual who was a very senior leader, very big international organization, and with a fantastic track record of success and a fantastic team around him. And his mental toughness score for emotional control was 3 on a scale of 1 to 10. So we're not going to talk about what that scale means. What that means, he was very mentally sensitive in terms of his emotional control, but he wasn't really aware of it, because his team had become his coping mechanism without him understanding it. So when he got overexcited about something, they would bring him down to earth and they'd kind of let him have his rant and bounce around the office. When he was down, they would help to pick him up. He was completely unaware that his team was his coping mechanism. He just saw his mood swings and all of that stuff as evidence of his passion, and being passionate about something is a good thing. So he didn't see a problem. Suddenly, January, February last year, everybody has to disperse and work from home. Things continue to work well, but occasionally things go wrong. But he's on his own now. So when something goes wrong, there's nobody to pick him up. And he just got more and more depressed to the point that within 6 weeks, he was at a doctor with a depression. He'd never, ever experienced that in 10 years. And that's not an uncommon story. It's not always about emotional control, but it's nearly always about some aspect of the mental toughness that hasn't been an issue in the past, but suddenly COVID had created a situation where that could no longer be contained or sustained.
Simply because he didn't have that support mechanism around him to, like you say, to be able to offload and talk to everyone.
But curiously, he had an astonishingly high level of achievement orientation. So that meant he delivered a lot. He worked really hard. He does work long hours. So his response to when he began to get under a bit of pressure and, he wasn't able to manage his emotions, was to work harder and harder and harder. And he ended up working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. So what was 6 months earlier a big strength had now turned into a massive weakness, because it was applying more and more pressure on somebody who couldn't manage his emotions. So, we'll go back, self-awareness.
And thinking about that in terms of psychological safety, if you're just getting caught up in the doing, working harder, and you're struggling with your emotional control, you're probably unlikely to be able to communicate to other people in that empathetic, caring sort of manner as well, because you're just so tunnel visioned in the way you go about things.
Well, yes, and there are consequences for the people around him, because one of the people around him suddenly began to feel the pressure, and he would channel some of his annoyance onto individuals who were all working remotely at home and who also didn't have any support mechanisms around them. So, he was creating a very unsafe environment psychologically for a lot of people.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Well, look, Doug, we'll look to wrap up now. It was intended to be quite a short discussion, and certainly I got a lot from it, and I hope the viewers and the listeners do as well. So a big thank you for your time, and I'll put some notes in the comments if people want to reach out to you.
It's always a pleasure working with you, David. Brilliant.
Thank you.